They called it the Iron Curtain, but in Asia it did not look like a wall or a fence. It looked like a line of ink on a map across the Sea of Japan, a strip of concrete in the Korean demilitarized zone, an unmarked doorway in a Tokyo backstreet that led from a Soviet safe house into the world of American intelligence. For Soviet officers stationed in the Far East, the border was not always a physical barrier. Sometimes it was a choice. Which side of the Pacific did they really want to live on? Most Cold War stories Americans hear are set in Berlin, Budapest, or Prague, but the Soviet Union also waged a shadow war in the East, sending pilots, spies, translators, and journalists to Japan, China, and North Korea. There, they moved through societies that were firmly plugged into the American-led order. U.S. bases bristling with radar, Japanese cities glowing with neon and electronics, South Korean troops patrolling shoulder to shoulder with GIs along the most heavily armed border on Earth. Every assignment the Kremlin gave them in Asia came with an unspoken risk that one day, after seeing too much, they might decide not to go home. In Moscow, defection was treated as treason of the highest order. The internal security system was built to prevent it. Foreign travel was a rare privilege, reserved for those with impeccable political records. Those who tried to escape and failed were sentenced to long terms in labor camps or confined to special psychiatric hospitals where powerful drugs were used as punishment. Families of defectors lost jobs, apartments, and educational opportunities. Soviet courts often handed down death sentences in absentia to men who had already vanished into the West. And yet, in the Far East, one after another, some of the people the system trusted most, intelligence officers, fighter pilots, embassy staff, looked around them and decided the future was not in Moscow, but on the other side of the Pacific. One of the first to do it was Yuri Rastovarov. He arrived in Tokyo in 1946, officially as an interpreter and diplomat, in reality as an officer of Soviet state security sent to rebuild and direct Moscow's spy networks in occupied Japan. For years, he moved through the ruins and then the rebirth of Tokyo, meeting Japanese politicians, ex-prisoners of war, and left-wing activists in back rooms, recruiting them as agents and informants for the Soviet cause. He watched as the United States poured money and technology into Japan's reconstruction, as American bases rose along the coast, as the Cold War line in Asia hardened across the Sea of Japan and the Korean Peninsula. By the early 1950s, the stress began to build. After Stalin's death, power struggles in Moscow claimed one of Rastovarov's patrons, security chief Lavrenti Beria, who was arrested and executed. Cleansings in the security services followed. When an order came for Rastovarov to return to the Soviet Union for consultations, he understood what that could mean. Men in his position did not always come back from such trips. In January 1954, he disappeared from Soviet circles in Tokyo. Instead of boarding a flight to Moscow, he slipped away and made secret contact with Western intelligence, first, according to later accounts, with a British officer, then with Americans. Within days, U.S. authorities had hidden him, quietly flown him out of Japan, very likely via a U.S. military base such as Okinawa, and brought him to the United States for debriefing. What he told them blew open a window into the Soviet world in Asia. Rastovarov described in detail how Soviet intelligence operated in Japan, how they had recruited Japanese prisoners of war, how they had cultivated politicians, how they tried to manipulate public opinion against the American alliance. In a particularly explosive briefing in 1955, he informed U.S. officials that some captured American and UN soldiers from the Korean War had been transported to camps in Siberia for further exploitation, an allegation summarized in a secret U.S. memorandum now declassified. That summer, the State Department did something unusual. It went public. In August 1954, American officials announced that a Soviet envoy spy who had disappeared in Tokyo had been granted asylum in the United States. Rastovarov himself appeared at a press conference in Washington and told reporters he wanted to live as a decent human being, a line that made front pages from New York to Sydney. The Kremlin lashed out, accusing Washington of kidnapping and sentencing him to death in absentia back in Moscow. For American viewers, the image was striking. Here was a man trained by the Soviet system who had spent years operating in Japan, choosing openly to stand beside U.S. officials and denounce the world he had served. Behind the scenes, his defection also showed something else, that in the Asian theater, the CIA and its allies already had the infrastructure to receive a high-level Soviet defector, fly him out under the nose of the KGB, and fold his knowledge into Washington's strategic picture. 2 decades later, Tokyo would again become the setting for another spectacular crack in the Soviet facade, this time not just an officer, but an entire warplane. On a September morning in 1976, people on Japan's northern island of Hokkaido looked up and saw something they had never expected: a Soviet MiG-25 Foxbat, one of the secretest fighters in the world, circling over the quiet city of Hakodate, gear down, fuel almost gone. On the controls was Lieutenant Viktor Belenko, a 29-year-old interceptor pilot from a Soviet air defense regiment near Vladivostok, who had just turned his training mission into a one-way flight to the west. For years, Western analysts had traded the MiG-25 as a near-mythical machine. Radar sightings suggested it could fly at more than 3 times the speed of sound and at altitudes that might threaten even the high-flying SR-31 Blackbird reconnaissance aircraft. In Washington, design teams for new U.S. fighters and bombers were being pushed to match what many assumed was a Soviet technological triumph in the skies. Belenko knew the reality from the cockpit. On September 6, 1976, he took off as ordered with a group of Foxbats. Once they were airborne over the Sea of Japan, he broke formation, dropped to about 30 meters above the waves to slip under Soviet and Japanese radar, and then turned his nose toward Japan. Only when he was close to Hokkaido did he climb high enough to be detected, giving Japanese controllers just minutes to react before he descended again, threading his way beneath the cloud cover. He nearly died in the attempt. As he lined up to land at the small civil airport in Hakodate, there was a Japanese BOAC 727 on the runway. Belenko brought the Foxbat down steep and hot, overshot most of the concrete, and only just managed to stop before the end, with less than a minute of fuel remaining in his tanks. Photos taken minutes later show the ungainly, scarred gray shape of the MiG-25 sitting awkwardly on a Japanese runway, ringed by policemen and curious ground crew. The Japanese government was suddenly at the center of a global crisis. The Soviet Union demanded the immediate return of aircraft and pilot, accusing Japan of abduction. The United States saw a once-in-a-generation intelligence windfall streaking across the tarmac in Foxbat camouflage. In a compromise that strained diplomatic niceties to the limit, Tokyo allowed U.S. experts to examine the MiG under tight secrecy before it was shipped back, disassembled, to the USSR. What those experts found was both impressive and revealing. The Foxbat was indeed fast, designed primarily as a high-altitude interceptor, but underneath its sleek lines, it was built in a way that spoke of different priorities and limitations. Instead of titanium and advanced composites, its structure was largely stainless steel, heavy but easier to manufacture in Soviet factories. Its avionics, instead of being dominated by solid-state electronics, still relied extensively on vacuum tubes, more resistant to electromagnetic impulses, but bulkier and less efficient than integrated circuits already common in new Western aircraft. In other words, for all its brute performance, the MiG-25 revealed a Soviet aerospace industry that could achieve high speed and altitude, but lagged behind the U.S. in miniaturization, computing, and material science. Belenko, meanwhile, was being debriefed in a very different environment from the hardened shelters of his old base. After requesting asylum, he was moved from Japanese custody into American hands, flown across the Pacific on a commercial airliner, and settled into a debriefing program that combined intelligence work with a crash course in the country he had chosen. In his autobiography and later interviews, he described his shock at American supermarkets, freeways, and the casual abundance of consumer goods, things he had been told were propaganda exaggerations. He had grown up in a system where a car was a once-in-a-lifetime purchase and meat was rationed. In the United States, he could walk into a parking lot and see more privately owned vehicles than an entire Soviet town possessed. He had flown one of his country's most prized fighter jets, only to learn that American air crews considered it a technological half-step behind their own designs. For American viewers, his story drew a simple, satisfying line. The man who defected with the superplane had discovered that the real cutting edge was on their side. If Japan was where the Soviets lost an airplane, the Korean demilitarized zone was where they almost sparked a new war to lose a man. In November 1984, a 22-year-old Soviet named Vasily Yakovlevich Matuzak was working as a translator for the Soviet embassy in Pyongyang. Born and raised in Moscow, fluent in foreign languages, he had been sent to North Korea to support the close ties between the two communist allies. But like many who served abroad, he had seen enough to begin doubting the system that had sent him. On November 23rd, he joined a group tour of the Joint Security Area at Panmunjom, the small cluster of blue conference buildings and guard posts that straddled the line between North and South Korea inside the DMZ. Tours like this were routine propaganda exercises. Visitors were shown the line of demarcation, listened to guides denounce the imperialist enemy, and posed for pictures at the border. Matuzak had another plan. As the group milled around near the famous buildings, he handed his camera to a North Korean soldier and asked for a photo. When the guard raised the camera and his gaze followed the viewfinder, Matuzak turned, sprinted, and crossed the low concrete line that marked the military demarcation line. In that instant, he went from guest to defector. North Korean guards reacted with fury. Around 30 soldiers drew pistols and rifles and charged after him, firing as they went, chasing him deep into the sector technically controlled by the United Nations Command. U.S. and South Korean troops, taken by surprise, scrambled to respond. A quick reaction force from a nearby U.S. camp, commanded by Captain Bert Mitsusawa, rolled in within minutes and returned fire to protect the fleeing Soviet. For about 40 minutes, the DMZ, the strip of land that had seen only sporadic clashes since 1953, erupted into what some later called a 40-minute Korean War. North Korean troops pinned down in a depression known as the Sunken Garden traded shots with American and South Korean soldiers. By the end of the firefight, one South Korean soldier lay dead and an American private, Michael Burgoyne, was wounded. At least 3 North Korean soldiers were killed and several others wounded and captured. Matuzak, strangely calm by his own later account, had thrown himself into a ditch and crawled into thick underbrush just south of the firefight. When U.S. troops finally reached him, he raised his hands and begged in halting English and Russian for protection. To make sure there was no doubt, he later recorded a video statement in which he declared that he had planned this escape for 2 years and had crossed the line deliberately to seek freedom. North Korea, backed by the Soviets, claimed he had wandered over the line by accident and been kidnapped by the Americans. The U.S. released the video to prove otherwise. The story of a Soviet sprinting toward American soldiers while North Korean troops poured fire into a UN sector was too symbolically powerful to leave in the shadows. Behind the cameras, the machine of Western exfiltration went into motion. Matuzak was moved quickly out of Korea, placed in the hands of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, and routed through Rome to the United States for permanent resettlement with the help of organizations like the International Rescue Committee. Somewhere on that journey, in an airport terminal or at a safe house, he had his first unfiltered look at the civilian side of the system he had chosen. Western airlines, bustling terminals, shops full of goods, newspapers criticizing their own governments without fear. For an American viewer, it is hard not to feel a surge of pride at that mental image. Soldiers from their country taking fire to shelter a citizen of their Cold War rival, then putting him on a plane not to a labor camp, but to a new life. Not all Asian defection stories were so cinematic. Many involved quieter calculations, longer routes, and the invisible work of intelligence officers on both sides of the Pacific. Japan remained a particular focal point, not just for pilots like Belenko, but for spies. In the mid-1970s, the KGB's main man in Tokyo was a Major Stanislav Alexandrovich Levchenko. Officially, he was a correspondent for the Soviet magazine New Times. In reality, he ran a significant KGB network targeting Japanese politics, media, and academia. Under his supervision, at least 10 fully recruited agents and over 200 informants fed Moscow information and influence from the heart of a U.S. ally. According to Levchenko's later testimony and his memoir, On the Wrong Side, his roster included an ex-cabinet minister and senior leader of a major parliamentary organization, top officials and activists in the Japanese Socialist Party, journalists with access to government intelligence, and scholars advising the Japanese government on China. Through them, the KGB sought to soften Japanese support for the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty and to prevent Tokyo from aligning too closely with Washington and Beijing in a three-way anti-Soviet front. For years, Levchenko lived a double life in a country where that life was increasingly hard to justify. By day, he moved through a capital that was arguably the most technologically advanced city on Earth, subways running to the minute, neon canyons in Shinjuku, electronics shops in Akihara bursting with gadgets that Soviet consumers could only dream about. By night, he went back to an embassy compound and wrote reports for a system that still struggled to produce enough cars and televisions for its own population. In October 1979, confronted with an order to return to Moscow that he had every reason to fear, he made his choice. Walking into the Sano Hotel, a facility used by U.S. military personnel in Tokyo, he identified himself to American officials as a KGB major and requested political asylum. Within hours, the quiet machinery of defection turned again. Levchenko vanished from the Soviet radar and reappeared under American protection, soon to be flown to the United States. His debriefings were devastating for the Moscow prestige in operations in Asia. In congressional testimony and public interviews, he laid out how the KGB had penetrated Japanese institutions, naming names and detailing operations. A Japanese parliamentary investigation followed. Several politicians and journalists were exposed, some forced to resign. For many Japanese viewers, it was a shock to see how deeply a foreign power had burrowed into their democracy. In the Soviet Union, Levchenko was tried in absentia and sentenced to death. KGB-linked operatives in the United States, including some later arrested in the Miller-Ogorodnikov spy case in California, were tasked with trying to track him down. In interviews, he said his ex-wife was ostracized and his son harassed, which only confirmed in his mind why he had left. For American audiences, Levchenko's story underscores a pattern. People trained to be instruments of Soviet power in Asia, embedded in cities lit by Japanese electronics and connected by American-backed infrastructure, found themselves increasingly out of sync with the future they saw around them. When they jumped, it was often into the waiting arms of the very system they had been sent to undermine. Not all Asian defection stories started in a Soviet uniform. Citizens of satellite states also used Asia as a backdoor into the West. One striking example comes from 1980s East Germany. In 1987, a young East German named Jens, disillusioned with life behind the wall, hit upon a plan that would take him not through Hungary or Czechoslovakia, but through Mongolia and China. Officially, he and his wife Marion traveled as students and tourists from East Germany to Ulaanbaatar, the capital of the Mongolian Republic, a close Soviet ally. From there, through a mixture of forged documents, bribery, and luck, they obtained Chinese visas and boarded a train to Beijing. In Beijing, they made for the West German embassy. Getting through the gates of an embassy like that was a goal many Eastern Bloc citizens shared, whether in Europe or Asia. On diplomatic soil, they knew local police could not simply drag them away. From there, a new path opened. Asylum procedures, quiet negotiations, and exfiltration flights that might, if all went well, carry them over the Iron Curtain without ever touching it from above. In Jenz's case, the journey after Beijing wound through Hong Kong, Dubai, and London before finally depositing him in West Berlin, a route that only makes sense on a globe marked by Cold War alliances and air corridors. It shows how, by the late stages of the conflict, Asia had become not just a battleground for superpowers, but a transit zone where the right combination of passports, embassies, and airline routes could carry someone from the heart of the Warsaw Pact to the capitalist world. All of these episodes, Rask-Forov in 1954, Belenko in 1976, Livchenko in 1979, Matizak in 1984, Jens and Marion via China, share three things. First, they involve individuals who had seen the Soviet system from the inside and concluded it could not match what they saw across the Pacific. Second, they relied on the existence of Western networks in Asia, CIA stations in Tokyo, US and UN commands in Korea, Allied embassies in Beijing and beyond. Third, they turned the very presence of Soviet power in the region, pilots stationed at Far Eastern bases, KGB officers in Japanese capitals, translators embedded in North Korea, into vulnerabilities that the West could exploit. For American viewers, there is a particular emotional charge in these stories. They echo the World War II narratives where German scientists fled to Allied lines, where prisoners ran toward American tanks, and where the industrial might of the United States overwhelmed the myth of Nazi invincibility. In the Cold War's Asian theater, the pattern repeats in a different key. A secretive Soviet fighter jet lands in a Japanese airport and is dissected by U.S. engineers who discover it is powerful but technologically crude compared to their own designs. A KGB major in Tokyo, running a network of spies in one of the world's biggest economies, looks around and decides that this, not Moscow, is where the future lies and defects to the very country he was paid to oppose. A young translator in Pyongyang bolts across the DMZ and ends up under the protection of American soldiers and UN officials who risk their lives to shield him from the regime he has just betrayed. On paper, the Soviet Union and its allies in Asia controlled vast territories, commanded huge armies, and fielded impressive weapons. In practice, as these men discovered, they struggled to give their own people what those people had seen in Japan's bullet trains, in American supermarkets, in South Korea's rapidly modernizing cities. A sense that technology, information, and prosperity were flowing forward, not being rationed out by a nervous state. That is why the Asian defection routes mattered far beyond the handful of individuals who walked, ran, or flew along them. Every time one of these stories hit the headlines, an envoy spy in Washington, a foxbat on a Japanese runway, gunfire around a fleeing Soviet at Panmunjom, it sent a message in both directions. To people inside the Eastern Bloc, it whispered that escape was possible and that the West was not just a caricature on Soviet television. To people in the United States and its allies, it confirmed that even among the ranks of their enemies, there were those who, when given a glimpse of the world on the other side of the Pacific, chose it over the one they had been born into. In the end, there was no single Asian pipeline for Soviet defectors, no one code name that tied all these operations together. There were scattered routes, improvised handoffs, and ad hoc alliances between spies, diplomats, and soldiers on the ground. But taken together, they reveal something profound about the Cold War, that its front lines ran not just through Europe, but through the airports of Tokyo, the conference huts of Panmunjom, the corridors of embassies in Beijing, and through the minds of the men Moscow sent there, who sometimes looked around and decided, quietly, that the future was on the other side.